This Literature Circle presentation reviews the book Dismantling Contemporary Deficit Thinking, Educational Thought and Practice by Richard Valencia, published in 2010. Our Literature Circle members are Stephanie Watts, Paula McMahon, Meg Homer, and Mike Flanagan. In this first part of the presentation, we will review Valencia's definition of deficit thinking and then briefly summarize the book. Valencia defines deficit thinking to be person-centric explanations for learning deficiencies. Deficit thinking results in a blame-the-victim model for the deficiencies. Valencia further believes that programs and initiatives that utilize deficit thinking to address deficiencies are ineffective because they address symptoms rather than causes. He advocates non-deficit thinking approaches that rely on system-centric explanations for deficiencies and addresses them accordingly. The difference between deficit and non-deficit thinking can best be thought of as the difference in meanings illustrated by the terms students at risk as a result of their individual natures and students placed at risk by the systems they interact with. Following the introduction to deficit thinking, Valencia walks us through three of the origins and foundations of deficit thinking in society and education policy. He first discusses neo-hereditarianism and declares it to be a pseudoscientific explanation that blames genetic differences between races for learning deficiency. His second foundation review is a critique of the works and presentations of Dr. Ruby Payne, theorist and trainer who posits a mindset of poverty as an explanation for deficient learning capabilities. Valencia's third deficit thinking foundation is the at-risk model of individuals as deficit-based explanation for deficient learning capabilities. Following those foundational critiques, he discusses practical solutions to dismantling deficit thinking approaches and replacing them with more effective tactics. Some of those tactics can be seen on this slide. Valencia concludes his book with a discussion around the currently favored standards-driven school model and its concomitant high-stakes testing. He considers that model to be highly deficit thinking oriented and provides what he believes to be evidence of that linkage. Following that discussion, he presents an alternative to the standards-driven model he calls democratic education, components of which can be seen on this slide. In the next section of the presentation, we will discuss the strengths of his identification of current popular educational theory as originating in deficit thinking.
Valencia addresses the genetic pathology model of deficit thinking, where it is assumed that one's genetic makeup from birth determines the ability, intellect, and learning opportunities that are available to that individual. He demonstrates that a variety of factors, including environment and socioeconomic status, can be determinant factors that correlate with learning and opportunity. He also identifies the perceived culture of poverty, where it is assumed that people's values perpetuate the culture rather than empowering them to escape their circumstance, which is then used as a rationalization of their choice rather than of their circumstance. There are many organizations and individuals that have contributed to our views of deficit thinking, sometimes in subtle and insidious ways. For example, the Pioneer Fund is an American non-profit foundation established in 1937 to advance the study of hereditary and human differences that still funds research today. How do we counteract this? Valencia suggests that we begin by looking at our own commonly used terms. Many people in education have utilized phrases that define student circumstances, concerns, and needs. Valencia challenges the use of the term at risk, for example, explaining that this type of terminology is at the very root of deficit thinking. He argues that this fails to acknowledge a student's abilities, resiliencies, and strengths. He posits that we should reframe the dialogue and use the term at-promise students to address their needs from a strength-based perspective and reframe the way students contextualize themselves. Another strength of Valencia's book is that he offers a variety of strategies to reframe individual perceptions. For example, working with pre-service education students to recognize and dismantle their deficit thinking by testing them when they say that they have a perceived lack of racism, challenging any easy answers they may provide, and addressing larger context issues, and allowing them to move beyond guilt so that they can work effectively within their own educational environments. He discusses replacing stereotypes with a recognition of individual strengths and helping parents deal with obstacles in parent participation. And he discusses expanding parental roles within the schools so that they can be more involved in their children's education.
Now we'll look at the book's limitations. According to Valencia, part of the reason deficit thinking is problematic is because it's in opposition to democratic education. But despite the cultural awareness Valencia demonstrates, he never mentions that democracy cannot be considered a universal ideal. We are left to wonder, therefore, how non-democratic societies might respond to this assumption that anything other than democratic education is a problem. Valencia also tells us that the term at-risk is rooted in deficit thinking because of the inherent tendency to pathologize these at-risk populations. However, those in the social sciences use the term in tandem with a discussion of both risk factors and protective factors. Many scholars might object to the assumption that at-risk is rooted in deficit thinking when so much of their work is aimed at enhancing protective factors. Finally, Valencia makes a good case that the culture of poverty is a result of deficit thinking. Certainly, we can't assume that people choose to remain in poverty because it's a lifestyle. But one might argue that there are forces at work in the media and pop culture that glorify living in poverty. Consider the concept of street cred and how this is portrayed in films and music, and the chastisement many people face for getting out of their poor neighborhoods, as if it's somehow a rejection of their culture or ethnic identity. Although most would agree with Valencia that the culture of poverty is derived from deficit thinking, it might be worth exploring whether culture of poverty has different meanings for those actually living in poverty. When we talk about the book itself, we have to talk about its lack of accessibility. The language is more sophisticated than it needs to be, and readers must be proficient in statistical analyses in order to fully understand the discussion of research. Ironically, Valencia might be alienating his audience when his message is really about inclusion. Beyond this, the language is callous and even sarcastic when discussing other researchers' work. His biting analyses, often valid, might paint him as a malcontent who will never be satisfied with any body of research. And so, readers might ask, should we bother listening to someone who's negative about everything? Because Valencia spends so much time reviewing others' research, the book reads more like a literature review. Although he does offer a few examples of programs that challenge deficit thinking, he provides no new evidence of his own. So the question is, what now? Although the ideas are promising and many may feel inspired after recognizing their deficit thinking tendencies, this is not a handbook for change.
Valencia challenges educational leaders to help dismantle deficit thinking on the way to positive change. The first step for leaders is to acknowledge their own biases and learn how to lead a diverse school. One research team encourages leaders to utilize 3 strategies in avoiding an equity trap. Neighborhood walks would include door-to-door welcomes by teachers as they distribute necessary school information. Oral histories are a second strategy in which teachers and students work together to build a union within the community as an effort to learn about one another. A third strategy would be to establish 3-way conferencing, including the teacher, parent, and student, which has the potential to increase understanding among all stakeholders. Students then take a more active role and ultimately greater responsibility for their education. The team also offers advice for leaders as they confront the equity trap. Principals should provide time for teachers to visit classrooms in which other teachers have been successful with students of color. After observing successful strategies, there should be discussion and reciprocal observations. This cycle continues until the appropriate success is achieved. With the increasing presence of marginalized student groups, social justice is gaining considerable momentum and attention. Valencia suggests schools must engage in programs and activities that will lead to equity and justice for all students. Strategies include increasing student achievement with high expectations for all students, improving school structure by avoiding tracking as well as increasing access to advanced courses, bolstering staff capacity through professional development designed to address inequalities, as well as in strengthening school culture and community as principals strive to create welcoming schools. These strategies lead to an increase in school involvement for marginalized families and a change in the negative stereotypical thinking. The school staff gain powerful insights, supported unconventional methods of reaching out to marginalized parents. Valencia suggests the alternative to deficit thinking is democratic education, with 2 main objectives. 1, developing an understanding of democracy through experiencing democracy, and 2, developing the skills of informed and responsible citizenship by exercising citizenship. On this slide, 7 components are listed which characterize a democratic education. Educational leaders need to implement strategies toward equal encouragement for all students to succeed.
As we conclude, we'd like to challenge our viewers to consider examples of deficit thinking from their own experience. Ask yourselves, rather than helping some students overcome systemic obstacles, How can you remove those obstacles altogether?